This is part 2 of organizational development, specifically looking at the 5th discipline, systems thinking. Systems thinking can be many things, but at its simplest, it's this idea of being able to, just as it sounds, look at entire systems. That might sound simple, but generally, like a fish swimming in water, we're sort of caught up in whatever system we are in, and it's hard for us to step aside and really look at what is going on and what we are a part of. This is why it's so hard for us to see the assumptions that we are making all the time. As thinking becomes more complex, we are able to step aside, so to speak, and view entire systems. Systems thinking is based on the natural world, the idea that in the natural world things occur in cycles and circles, and thus they are sustainable and they can support themselves, as opposed to a mechanized world where things are linear or hierarchical, which makes them fragile and they can break. Here are some basic systems thinking principles, just a few to consider out of the many. Cause and effect are not closely related. Fail fast, which means in a school or business context, instead of being worried about right or wrong, just try something out and fail as fast as possible so that you can learn from those failures and try a new idea. Small changes can produce big results, so we look for a leverage point. We look for a small thing we can do that can make a really big difference in the system. Both and thinking. Instead of thinking in dualities of right or wrong, we want to have it all. We don't want to just be inside or outside. How can we be both inside and outside at the same time? There's no blame. Instead of blaming a person when something goes wrong, we look at what the whole system is that created those circumstances. So in the system of education, for instance, if one child fails, we don't blame the child. We figure out what's going on with the system. Talked about biomimicry. And living systems are whole. They have integrity. That's an aspect of biomimicry. So systems thinking can be a science, it can also be a disposition or a way of being. It can be skills, it can be all of these things. One thing systems thinking has to do with is looking beneath the surface. This has to do with personal mastery, right? We check our assumptions and biases and our blind spots and have a habit of thinking below our reactions and impulses. So on a systemic level, on a larger level, when we see an event happen, we don't just react. We think, well, what just happened? And then we go beneath the surface. This is called the iceberg model. Right beneath the surface, we have patterns and trends. Have we seen something similar to this before? And then we go to systems design. What forces are at play that created this event? And then at the very bottom is transformation. So we think about mental models. What way of thinking created this result? And how can we change our thinking? How can we change our consciousness to create a different result? Another way of thinking about systems is the science of causal maps, sometimes called systems archetypes. Scientists have identified 12 different archetypes, and they can become incredibly complicated when they're put together into causal maps. But we're just going to look at the very simple aspects of causal maps. Thinking in systems archetypes, we have causal maps. One very simple loop, again, so everything's in circles, is a reinforcing loop. So people want widgets. As a company, we make more widgets and they end up buying more. And when people buy more, we decide to make more. We make more, they buy more, and it goes around and around until we're making so many widgets. It just goes up and up and up and up, increases and increases. That's a reinforcing loop. There's a plus sign here and a plus sign there. And then there's this other kind of loop, a balancing loop. A thermostat is the proverbial representation of a balancing loop. If I have the temperature at my house set at 72, let's look at one factor, which is the level of the heat in the house. When it gets too cold in the house, that's factor 1, and my thermostat is going to kick on the heat. The heat is going to increase, and factor 2 is going to be that thermostat is going to kick off. That's a balancing loop to bring the temperature back down to 72. So it just stays the same all the time. Once it gets a little too high, it gets lower again. The next aspect of these loops is we have to think about delays. Humans like to think of cause and effect in very close relationship to each other, but sometimes effects from something might be days down the line, weeks down the line, years, lifetimes, centuries later, there are effects sometimes. So we might be selling more widgets because people want widgets, but we're not aware that underneath the surface, there's something else that's happening. So think about that iceberg. We're going underneath the surface and there's a delay, something that is happening that's going to affect our widget making. It could be that we're using up all of the resources required to make widgets, and that's going to affect our ability to continue to make widgets and to make money. So one archetype that uses these loops is the fixes that fail archetype. Fixes that fail mean we do something that seems obvious to fix the problem, but then there is a delay, so much later something happens that negatively affects the desired outcome. There was a concern in the 1980s that instructional quality and coherence was low in our American schools, and so there was a top-down mandated standardized curriculum, which maybe appeared like it increased student achievement for a time. It was a reaction that seemed obvious. Then beneath the surface, taking much longer, is a delay, results that we don't see until much later, unintended results, unintended consequences. In this case, it could be teaching to the lowest common denominator, or it could be the poor mental health issues that we now have in our public school system. So when we think about these different causal maps, what's the point of systems thinking? Well, it's so that we can apply them to our lives and our organizations and our society to understand better what's going on so that we can create better results and not make so many mistakes. So we're going to look at just one particular domain as an example, and that is looking at racism, systemic or structural racism. I'm going to use systemic and structural interchangeably, and we're going to look at this metaphor of the groundwater approach based on a really simple to read, fantastic article called The Groundwater Approach. So the metaphor is this. You're walking along a lake and you see a dead fish. You don't think much of it. Dead fish happen. You might wonder, oh my gosh, was this fish not taken care of? Did it eat something toxic? Was it in the wrong school? Then the next day you're walking along and half the fish in a lake are dead. Well, then you might think about it a little bit more. My goodness, there's something wrong with this water or this lake. Why are the conditions turning up dead fish? Is the lake contaminated? You start to wonder, And then a week or two later, or months later, or years later, there are 5 lakes in the area that all have half the fish dead. The metaphor in the article on the groundwater approach is that when you have so many students of one particular race, in this case, African American race, that are doing so poorly or having such poor outcomes in the educational system, that doesn't seem possible without something else going on beneath the system. It turns out that 95% of the surface water on the earth is actually groundwater. So each lake may seem separate, but they're all connected. And when the results for African Americans are so poor across so many different systems and institutions, not just education, but criminal health and all these other systems, that's when you start realizing that there's a systemic or structural problem. In the article, the authors point to structural racism as part of the reason for these results, and they don't totally explain what that means. In our country, there's a different status that's informally given to people of different races. It's hard to accept, but the understanding is that essentially that white people are at the top of the racial status scale. And that has negative results for people who have lower status. And one way to look at that and understand that is to look at one of the system's archetypes. It's called success to the successful.
In this session, I will talk about the success to the successful archetype. This structure is actually two reinforcing loops that interact in such a way that it causes one loop to grow and the other one to actually diminish. The situation is such that the resources provided on one side are responsible for the success on that side, and resources on the other side are responsible for the success on that side. Though if for some reason or another, one, either A or B, demonstrates more success than the other, because of the nature of the structure, it will then allocate more resources to whichever one of them is more successful. And because they're reinforcing loops, any little bit of additional resources ends up being amplified very readily, so that if B should demonstrate slightly more success than A, it will end up getting more resources and demonstrating more success than A, because the allocation of resources to A has been diminished. So the more success B demonstrates, the more resources it gets, and the fewer resources A gets, so its success declines. And this structure will cause things to become extremely lopsided very readily. This structure is sometimes called the self-fulfilling prophecy, where I think that Tina is smarter than Susie, so I spend more time coaching Tina, and therefore she performs better than Susie, so I've been proven correct, and I continue to coach Tina and not Susie, and Susie becomes a failure while Tina becomes a superstar because of all the coaching that she's been given. If I run this model, notice that the resources are allocated in such a way that B continues to demonstrate tremendous success and A demonstrates no success any longer. They've been completely derailed. So and the sad thing about it is, seldom is it ever realized ahead of time, and more often than not, it's not even realized after it happens. It's typically just assumed that one person or one group is less performant than another, and time isn't spent to investigate beneath the surface to realize that they are in fact victims of what's happening in the structure and the allocation. And we do that at times without even realizing that we've made that judgment, which is why I continue to say that we need to spend time to challenge the assumptions under which we operate. And much of the time that we spend, we operate in autopilot, not aware of the biases under which we actually decide to do things. So the approach for this structure is, when you see it happening, ask yourself, is there actually an underlying basis to what's happening? Is it really the group or the individual that's at fault, or are they being under-resourced in some way that's causing them to be less performant than the other group? So it's more often than not, it's a structural problem. Hope you found this informative.
Success to the successful is an archetype that can help us understand how that status can create so much advantage over time. So in the end, what is the purpose of systems thinking? Well, it's to create better results. Remember that systems dynamics are often hidden. So the art of systems change is to help people, both as individuals and collectively, groups of people, understand how systems operate, so we can behave differently to stave off bad outcomes and to increase good ones. So essentially, humans all want the same things. We want to avoid misery and pain, and we want to increase our happiness. But often, if we don't look at the systems, we do things that actually increase misery and pain. So the goal is to change people's worldview so that it's more sophisticated and capable for surviving and thriving in increasingly complex times. So if we don't learn how to find happiness, so to speak, through understanding our systems better, these complex times could threaten our survival. And finally, thinking of ourselves as leaders, whether you are a leader in status or whether you're a leader just in disposition and the influence you have. Senge wrote a recent article with some colleagues that outlines 3 simple capabilities, core capabilities of systems leaders: the ability to see the larger system, fostering reflection and more generative conversations, and shifts the collective focus from reactive problem solving to co-creating the future.